Thursday, April 17th, 2098, 4:35 p.m. U.S. Department of Justice Headquarters Building, Joint Base Grissom. I had just finished my coffee and looked at my watch. It had been a very long day and I couldn't wait for it to be over. I had spent 3 hours giving testimony and answering questions before I was placed in this tiny room, with nothing but a television and my own thoughts to keep me company. I was asked to wait here until further notice, but that was over 2 hours ago. Surely, I thought, the council must have come to some conclusion by now. Suddenly, the door opened and my legal representative, Commander Tom Baker, entered the room. "The council has just adjourned for the day, Lieutenant Jones," he said. "That's me, by the way. William Jones, bill to my friends and family. I'm a senior flight lieutenant in the United States Space Corps, which used to be called the Space Force and was formed almost 80 years ago. They want you back at 0800 tomorrow, so you'd better get back to your quarters," Commander Baker said. "And remember, don't socialize with any of the other witnesses in this case, especially not with your wife." "You mean the cheating whore known as my soon-to-be ex-wife, don't you, sir?" I asked. He nodded his head. "Yes, she is," he said. "Come on, Lieutenant, get out of here and stay out of trouble." "Aye, sir," I said, standing up. I stretched out my legs, grabbed my briefcase, and walked out the door. I got into my tiny electric car and headed back to BOQ. That's Bachelor Officers' Quarters, for those unfamiliar with the term. Once I got to my room, I took off my uniform, grabbed a frozen faux meat hamburger, and threw it in the microwave. While it was cooking, I got a beer out of the refrigerator and unscrewed the lid. When my hamburger was ready, I pulled it out and ate it in 3 big bites, trying not to notice the flavor. They were good for camping or a quick snack, but they were a poor substitute for the real thing, which was getting harder and harder to get. I leaned back in my chair and turned on the TV to catch up on the latest news. But nothing caught my attention, so I leaned back in my chair and reflected on the past few weeks. Until recently, I had been the weapons officer on the USS Armstrong, the Corps' newest, largest, fastest, and most advanced spaceship. Named for the astronaut who first set foot on the moon in 1969, the Armstrong was considered the most advanced machine built by human hands. It seated 110 officers and crew members and was powered by 2 plasma-ion propulsion systems. It was claimed that Armstrong could reach Jupiter in less than 50 days. In addition, Armstrong had enough firepower to destroy anything that threatened it. In addition to nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, it carried 3 pulse-energy cannons, a railgun, and several short-range mini-lasers that worked very much like the old miniguns of the early 21st century. In short, it was a cool ship, and my hand was controlling all that firepower. Why all that firepower, you might ask? About 45 years ago, one of our shuttles was attacked by an Iranian spacecraft. Unfortunately, the shuttle was unarmed and had no means of defense. A missile fired by the Iranians hit the shuttle from below and destroyed it. Outer space is the most inhospitable environment known to man, so everyone died instantly. We almost started a war because of this incident, but the diplomats somehow managed to avoid it. However, the Space Corps decided that from now on, every manned ship in its fleet would be armored and equipped for combat. Receiving orders to serve on the Armstrong, making its maiden voyage to Jupiter, was all the more gratifying because my wife of 5 years, Tabitha, or Tabby as she liked to call herself, was assigned to the same ship. Unlike me, however, she would serve as the ship's chief pilot. At first, I was beyond excited that we would be serving together on the newest ship in the fleet. It was the first time we were both assigned to the same ship at the same time. We were high school sweethearts who vowed to be exclusive to each other shortly after we turned 18. We both wanted to fly into space and apply to the academy, our senior year of high school. We were accepted and got engaged right after high school, planning to get married after graduating from the academy. She got her wish and became a pilot. I did not become a pilot and was assigned to operations and weapons. I was discouraged by this at first, but the more I shot and blew things up, the more I enjoyed it. After graduating from the academy, we got married, each in our dress uniforms. We were assigned to the same base, but unfortunately our missions often kept us apart. It's hard when one spouse is constantly off in space for 2 months or so, but it's even worse when both are doing the same thing. Sometimes she would go on a mission for 2 months and I would stay home and wait for her. Sometimes it was me who went on the mission. There were times when we both left at the same time, but on different missions. Needless to say, we didn't spend much time together, so we made the most of the time we had. Don't get me wrong, I didn't sit at home idling while she was away. I became interested in a fairly new type of martial arts called GravTac, which was designed specifically for low to medium pressure conditions. I had practiced martial arts back in high school, and I was immediately attracted to it. It required strength, tactical thinking, and knowledge of how objects react in low-gravity environments. In all that time, I never even considered the possibility that Tabby might cheat on me. I always trusted that she would do the right thing, so I never worried about it. Although I was tempted at times, I decided that I would never cheat on the woman I loved. So the thought that she might be seeing someone behind my back never even crossed my mind. I remembered how we used to fantasize about making love in weightlessness, on the moon or Mars. We always said that if the opportunity presented itself, we would definitely try it, at least once. So naturally, when we both got our orders to serve on the Armstrong, it was like a dream come true for us. Unfortunately, that dream turned into a nightmare from which there was no way out. My thoughts went back to the day I left. Friday, January 3rd, 2098, Canaveral Launch Complex, Florida. Putting on my spacesuit and launch kit, I said nothing as the technicians seated me in the seat of the passenger shuttle that would take me and 20 others to the orbital dock where the Armstrong was located. Tabby, as chief pilot, went up to the first shuttle, which had launched a little over 3 hours ago. I was in the third shuttle that launched that day. It would be followed by 3 more. Sitting next to me was the Armstrong's first officer, Commander Jason Travers, or Bull, as he was known for his size and general demeanor. I knew Bull from back at the academy. He was an instructor there when Tabby and I were in school, and back then, he was a hard-ass who didn't put up with anyone's crap. He demanded that students give 110% and wouldn't settle for less. He was also Tubby's counselor at the time. I had taken a few of his classes, but other than that, I had little contact with him. "So, Jones, can't wait to finally serve with your wife?" Bull asked. "Yes, sir. Looking forward to it," I replied. "Well, this will go down in history," he said. "I hear we're going farther than anyone before us," I told him. "Jupiter and back in less than 100 days," he said. "It's going to be a very interesting mission." I could feel and hear the pumps working beneath us in the rocket that would eventually lift us into the sky, and I knew we would be leaving Earth very soon. Bull knew it too, as did everyone else in the shuttle. We were all spaceflight veterans, so this was nothing new to us. Bull looked around to make sure everyone was ready to leave. "So everyone says goodbye to Earth. That's it, so get over it," he growled, resting his head back on the chair cushion. We closed our visors and got ready to launch. We felt the car shake as the engine started, and then felt the tremendous force of gravity as the rocket began to take off. Looking out the window, I watched the clouds float by as we rose into the sky. Soon the blue sky turned black and I could make out the curvature of the planet below. I never tired of looking at it. The shuttle shuddered as the boosters disengaged. I knew they would fall back to Earth and land near where we took off from so they could be used again. After about an hour, I saw some sort of structure in the distance. "There it is," Bull said, opening his visor. "We'll be docking soon." Half an hour later, the shuttle approached a large open dock and brought its speed in line with that of the dock. 2 large tubular structures emerged from it and made contact with the shuttle. A hiss of air was heard as the pressure in the dock stabilized. "That's it," Bull said. "Prepare to feel the gravity. The pressure on the ship should be 0.8 G. I knew from the orientation documents that the Armstrong was equipped with a gravity system that could be adjusted as needed. This would help alleviate the effects of prolonged weightlessness, which included fluid shifts, muscle atrophy, and loss of bone mass. We waited for a signal from the crew, and soon a green light flashed over the hatches. Bull unbuckled his harness and stood up, ordering the others to follow suit. After he stepped out into the aisle, I unbuckled my harness and stood up, grabbing my bag. It was strange going from the near-zero gravity of the shuttle to the somewhat reduced but present gravity of the ship. After only a few steps, I could already feel the weight of my backpack and bag. "Station launch in 4 hours, people," Bull called out as we entered the ship. "Let's get going. There are 3 more shuttles right behind us." I already knew where our quarters were from the orientation materials, so I headed there first, hoping to see Tabby. Unfortunately, she wasn't there, but I could tell she was already in her quarters because her stuff took up half the space in our tiny closet. I put away my gear, took off my heavy spacesuit, and put on my normal flight suit. Grabbing my black uniform cap, I headed to the bridge to take my place at the weapons console. I had a lot of work to do before we could launch. When I got there, the bridge was bustling with work. Tabby was working on the pre-flight checklist, so I left her alone. I turned on the console and ran the calibration procedures, then printed out the weapons list. I then walked over to the two cruise missile platforms, physically checked the serial numbers on the list, and made sure the locks were in place. I then walked over to each of the weapon stations and made sure they were locked and ready for immediate use. I then returned to the bridge to report to the captain on my supplies. I had to wait for the medic to finish his report before I could present my supplies, but I was fine with that. When the doc left, the captain looked at me. I recognized him immediately. Captain Alan Simmons. "Lieutenant Jones," he said, taking the inventory sheet from me. "As I recall, we served on the Shepherd." "Yes, sir, we served," I replied. He signed the inventory and we checked our key numbers. Only 3 people had keys to the cruise missiles: me, the captain, and the first officer. 2 of those 3 keys were required to launch the missiles. "Good to have you with us, Jones," he said. "I understand you and our chief pilot are married." Hearing this, Tabby turned and smiled. "Yes, sir, we are married," I told him. "Good," Alan said. "That will help make your journey more exciting." "Yes, sir, I hope so," I said, looking at Tabby. She gave me a mischievous smile and then went back to her business. By then, Bull had already made it to the bridge and was strutting around checking to make sure everything was in place. Bull threw me a look that could freeze a solar flare, and I took it as a hint that it was time to return to my post. "I'd better get back to my station, sir." Alan nodded his head and turned to the next person requiring his attention. I returned to my post and checked that all calibration tasks had been completed. From my perspective, everything was locked down and in perfect order. I knew from my time on the Shepherd that Captain Simmons liked to have impromptu weapons drills and target practice from time to time, so it was important for me to be ready to lock and load weapons at a moment's notice. It was also important that the aiming system always remain calibrated. Generally, once calibrated, the system stayed that way unless there was a major malfunction or someone tampered with it. Nevertheless, each shift began with a calibration check. Finally, Alan began a pre-launch check of each station while we all buckled into our chairs. "Operative," he called out. "All systems ready for launch," replied Lieutenant Commander Alice Brewster, the operations officer and my immediate supervisor. "Engineering," Alan repeated. "All systems are normal and within normal parameters. Proceed to launch, sir," Lieutenant CM Brian Faulkner, Chief Engineer, replied. "Weapons." "All systems calibrated and locked, sir." "All guns accounted for," I said. "Communications." "Communications 5x5, sir," Lieutenant Commander Denise Simpson, the Senior Communications Officer, said. "Navigation." "Course plotted and locked, sir." "Estimated time of arrival at Mars Station is 440 hours, reported the Senior Navigator, Lieutenant Ryan Halcomb, whose console was next to Tabby's console at the front of the bridge. "Number 1. All personnel are in place and accounted for, sir. All stations are ready to go," Bull reported from his console, located just behind and to Alan's left. Alan nodded his head and pressed a button on the console in front of him. "Houston, this is Armstrong, requesting launch authorization." "Launch authorization granted, Armstrong." "Godspeed," came a voice from the communications speaker overhead. Alan nodded his head and pressed the button on the console again. "Roger that, Houston," he said. He pressed another button and spoke again. "Spaddock, this is Armstrong. Launch authorization has been received. Shut down and retract all lines." "Copy that, Armstrong. Lines retracting." We heard a few sharp sounds and realized it was the lines retracting. From that point on, we were on our own. After a few moments, we heard confirmation that all lines were fully retracted and the ship could move forward. "Start the engines," Alan ordered. "Engines are running," Brian replied. "Take us out, helmsman. Nice and easy, don't scratch the paint," Alan said with a smile. "Aye, sir," Tabby replied as she pulled 2 levers and took hold of the control column. The ship slowly began to move forward, and I could see the exit from the spaceport getting closer. I knew we were only running on maneuvering thrusters at this point. Firing the ion fusion plasma thrusters inside the space dock would do serious damage to both the dock and Armstrong. Soon, we were away from the large structure. The space dock is ready, Tabby said. From here, we'll spiral down from Earth orbit to a point between the Earth and the Moon, where we'll fire two large engines. Q-Spot, it was called, and I could see the tracking on the navigator's console from where I sat. An hour later, the navigator pronounced, "Estimated time of arrival at Q dot is 2 microns, sir," Ryan said. "The road is clear." That meant the forward sensors had not detected any debris or organic material, such as rocks, in our path that could damage the ship. "Acknowledged," Alan said. "Engineering." "Engines warmed up and ready, sir," Brian said. Alan pressed a button on his console. "Houston, Armstrong, approaching point Q." "Approaching point Q. Repeat, Armstrong." We all watched the countdown timers on our consoles and got ready. When the timer reached 0 o'clock, Alan spoke again. "Pump up the tires and light the fire, helmsman. Let's see what this girl can do." Tabby's hands fluttered over the console as she answered. "Inflate the tires and light the fire." "Aye, sir," she said. She moved the control levers all the way forward, and we all felt the initial force as the ion fusion plasma engines opened. We heard a faint hum as the engines increased speed and felt the G-force build up. I realized that at this point we were flying through space faster than a human had ever flown. I looked at Tabby, feeling a sense of pride in the way she was handling herself in this huge ship. She looked back at me and I smiled, winked, and gave her a thumbs up. She smiled back. When I looked at Bull, I thought he was about to explode, so I went back to my console. About an hour later, I got my first clue that all was not going to be well on this voyage when Bull posted the officer's schedule on the bridge. I wasn't surprised that he posted the schedule, usually the first mate did it, but I was surprised to see that I'd been put on the second shift. You must realize that in space, there is no such thing as night or day. Our chronometers, like all the other ships in the Corps, are synchronized with the chronometers in Houston. When night falls in Houston, the lights on the ship are dimmed considerably to let the crew know that night has fallen. This usually happens during the second shift. Officers on the captain's bridge usually work 12-hour shifts. Thus, there are two shifts, first shift and second shift. There is a long tradition in the Corps of putting the senior bridge officers on the first shift and the less experienced and lower-ranking officers on the second shift. This is not prescribed in any way, and the first officer has quite a bit of leeway in this matter. But it was still frustrating when Bull moved me to the second shift. It was almost like a demotion. Worse, it meant that Tabby and I would have almost no time together since she would be working first shift. If I was lucky, we might get to see each other for a few minutes during my shift. To say I was pissed off was an understatement, and Bull knew it. "Is there a scheduling problem, Lieutenant?" I heard Bull ask. I looked up and saw him in front of my console. By this time, Alice had come up to me. She had obviously seen the schedule too, and like me, was interested in his explanation. "Am I still the senior weapons officer, sir?" I asked. "Of course you are," Bull replied. "Then why am I working the second shift?" "Because I think it's the best place for you," he said, his voice beginning to draw attention. "Look, Lieutenant, if you have a scheduling problem, work it out with the captain, through me." By this time, Alan had approached my console. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" he asked. "Lieutenant Jones doesn't seem to like the schedule on the bridge, sir," Bull said. Alan looked at the schedule and frowned as he read it. "I can understand how he feels, number one," Alan said. "It's very unusual, don't you agree?" "Yes, sir. Under normal circumstances, I would agree," Bull said. "I simply believe that Lieutenant Jones's knowledge and experience is best utilized on the second shift, and I believe it will give us an opportunity to train some of the other artillery officers, to give them experience on the bridge on the first shift." At that moment, my delusion detectors went off. I couldn't believe the nonsense he was spouting at the captain. "Is that the only reason, Commander? Or is there something else?" Alan asked. Obviously, he didn't believe it either. "If I may, sir, I'll speak freely," Bull said quietly. "Always number one," said Alan. "I've never been a big fan of spouses working on the same ship, especially in such close quarters. I don't want either of them distracted from their duties." "That's what I thought," Alan said. I understand your feelings, but I won't let this tour affect their morale. Make sure they spend time with each other, do you hear me? Yes, sir, Bull said. Alan looked at me before he spoke. Can you do that, Lieutenant? He asked. Yes, sir, I said. He nodded his head. Good, carry on, all of you, he said before walking away. Bull stared after me for a moment, and then a smirk appeared on his face. Don't worry, Jones. I'll keep an eye on your wife, he said, before walking away. I looked at Alice and was about to say something, but she put a finger to her lips. Don't say anything, Bill, she said. We'll talk later. Go ahead. I'll call Lieutenant Robinson. Yes, ma'am, I said quietly. I glanced over at Tabby and noticed that she was trying to focus on some place on her console. I could see that her face was flushed, but I wasn't sure if it was from embarrassment or guilt. I turned and walked off the bridge, feeling more embarrassed and humiliated than I ever had on the ship. Something about it stank to high heaven. I headed for the galley, hoping to get something to eat. It wasn't the usual mealtime, and I knew they wouldn't have anything special, but I needed something in my stomach. Not much in stock right now, Lieutenant, said the man behind the plexiglass partition. All we have are hamburgers made of artificial meat. They taste crappy, but they're guaranteed to fill you up. Sorry. That's enough for today, I said. I'll take one. He took one and put it on my tray. He held out a small package of flavored ketchup. Say, nah, would you like some axle grease to make it more flavorful? He asked with a smile. Sure, why not? I said, taking the package. Thanks. Anytime, Lieutenant, he said. I grabbed a small bottle of chocolate milk and headed to a vacant table. I ate the burger, slathered the flatbread with ketchup, and chugged the milk. The commander was right. It tasted like shit, but I was full. And the ketchup made it taste a little better. I put the tray away, threw the trash in the container, and headed for my quarters. I laid down on my shelf and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I wondered what Bull was really up to. What did he mean about looking after Tabby? I tossed and turned for about an hour, but I couldn't settle down. Frustrated, I finally got up and put on my workout clothes. A t-shirt and shorts. I put on my shoes and socks and headed for the small gym on one of the lower decks. Once there, I was relieved to see that I was alone. Good, I thought. This will give me a chance to vent my frustration without talking to anyone, which I didn't think I could do without losing my temper. I stretched a little, then did a little workout on the treadmill and the weight machine. Then I went to the gravity regulator on the wall and lowered the gravity in the room to 0.4 G. I could feel the difference. I immediately felt the difference. I spent the next half hour practicing some of the gravity techniques I had learned before leaving Earth. By then I was sweating profusely and felt like I could finally fall asleep. I put the Gravitac back in place and returned to my quarters. I showered in the tiny shower room, set my alarm clock, and lay down. I fell asleep in the blink of an eye. When the alarm rang, I got up, showered, shaved, put on my uniform, and headed to the galley for a snack. It was much better than the fake meat hamburger I'd had before. I got to the bridge just as Tabby was leaving. Hello, stranger, I said when I saw her. She looked up at me and smiled. Hi, she said. Look, I didn't get a chance to tell you, but I think you did a hell of a job with the launch, I said. Thanks, she replied to me. Look, maybe I'll come over on my lunch break and we can spend some time together, I said. I could see the wheels turning in her head and thought she was going to make me an excuse as to why it wouldn't work. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Sure, I'll set the alarm, she said. Maybe you can eat me instead of one of those fake burgers. Works for me, I said. I'll see you in 6 hours. I'll be there, she said and gave me a quick kiss. I love you. I love you too, I told her. I watched her walk away and thought that maybe we could make it work. Turning around, I saw Bull's smirking face. About damn time you showed up, Jones, he said. I glanced at my watch. My shift doesn't officially start until 15 minutes from now, Commander, I said. I just wanted to talk to my wife before going on duty, if you don't mind, sir. For a moment, I thought he was going to pounce on me, but he calmed down. Yes, all right, he said, and walked further down the corridor. I went out to the bridge and took over from Lieutenant Robinson. He handed me my shift and walked out. Alice came up to me as I began the calibration procedure. How are you holding up? She asked. I'm fine, ma'am, I replied. Drop the ma'am thing, Bill, she said. We've worked together before. Seriously, how are you holding up? It's not easy, but I'll get through it, Alice. Thanks for asking. You're welcome. Look, I know you have a lot on your mind, but I think you need to take care of your wife and Commander Travers. I looked at her, shocked. Do you think there's something between them? I asked. Maybe. Call it female intuition if you want, Bill. I just have a feeling there's something going on there. I've seen it before. Little glances here and there, that sort of thing. Nothing overt, but there's definitely a spark between those two, she said. Got it, Alice. Thanks for letting me know. I plan to meet with her on my lunch break. Hope that helps, I said. I hope so too, Bill, she said. Should I tell the captain? I asked her. She shook her head. Not unless you have hard evidence against them. That kind of accusation against a senior officer can backfire and severely damage your career, she said. Just stay alert and try to keep your wife alert. I'll keep an eye on things during the first shift. Okay, Alice, I said. Thanks for the heads up. She nodded her head and left the bridge. I checked the calibration procedure and went to inventory the cruise missiles and inspect the weapons stations. When I returned, Alan was already waiting for me. Would you like to practice target practice? He asked. Hell, I'm always up for target practice, I thought to myself. Yes, sir, I told him. Good, he said. Launch some drones and see what you can do. I set the station to launch a series of 5 drones, then activated the short-range mini-lasers. They acted just like the old miniguns. A series of 6 powerful and very hot lasers were set up just like the old Gatling guns. The laser fire from these weapons was very intense and could burn through several inches of armor in the blink of an eye. I once saw them cut an old armored battleship in 2. The belt armor on it was over 12 inches thick, but the lasers cut through it like a hot knife through butter. Once the drones were launched, I aimed the mini-lasers at them. The system was designed to track and fire on up to 10 targets simultaneously. It only took a second or two for the lasers to destroy the drones. I glanced at my console and saw the message. All targets destroyed. Good job, Lieutenant, Alan said with a smile. Thank you, sir, I replied. He got up from his chair and walked over to my desk. I'm going to get some rest, Lieutenant. It looks like you'll be the senior officer on watch, so why don't you take the center chair? I'll be back just in time for your lunch break, he said with a knowing smile. Having served with Alan before, I knew him as the Sleep King. He was one of those people who could stay awake for almost 24 hours with only 3 or 4 hours of sleep. I assumed it came with years of command experience. Yes, sir, thank you, I said in reply. He left the bridge and I took his place. It felt good to be sitting in the commander's chair. From here, I could keep an eye on everything that was happening on the ship. And then it hit me. Each crew member wore a device on their wrist that not only showed the time and served as an alarm clock, but also served as a communicator, a tracking device, and monitored our vital signs. All crew members were required to wear the device at all times. It was only allowed to be taken off when showering. I turned on the tracking monitor on the command console and looked for Travers. The monitor showed that he was in his quarters. More accurately, the monitor showed that the tracker was in his quarters. Looking a little deeper, I noticed that he was in a deep sleep, and his pulse rate was normal for someone in that state. That could only happen if he was actually wearing the thing. I looked up Jones and was given 2 choices: William, me, and Tabitha. I chose Tabitha and saw that her beacon was in our quarters. Good. Like Bull, her beacon showed she was asleep and the readings were normal for someone in that condition. I thought about accessing the history of both beacons, but realized I would need a command or medical password to do so. And since I had neither, I couldn't tell if the 2 of them were engaged in other, more strenuous activities. But what I saw was enough, I thought. It would be very difficult for them both to fake something like that, so I turned off the tracking monitor and went about my business. I looked around the bridge. Everyone was busy in their seats and working hard. It was like I wasn't even here. I went back to my console and reviewed the checklist. So far, everything was working within normal limits. We were due for a course correction in about an hour, but I knew it was already programmed into the navigation system and would be done automatically. The communications officer on watch was in constant communication with someone in flight control in Houston. and I knew I would not have to intervene unless a situation arose that required the captain's immediate intervention. The engineer on duty was closely monitoring the condition of the engines and the ship's vital systems. The helmsman and navigator closely monitored the ship's flight, making sure that the upcoming course correction would go smoothly. I made the necessary log entries for the hour and walked over to the weapons console to make a quick check. Everything seemed to be in order, so I walked back to the center chair and sat down. About 2 hours into the shift, Petty Officer Marks went around to all the stations collecting drink orders for everyone. We were allowed to drink in our seats, but on the condition that they were covered and straws were used. She left and returned a short time later from the galley handing out drinks to everyone. A few minutes before I was due to start lunch, Alan returned, and I conceded the big chair to him, briefly recounting the events that had transpired so far. He nodded his head, sat back in his chair, and made an entry in his journal. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said. "Why don't you go on your lunch break?" he added, with a slight wink. "Yes, sir," I said as I left my post. I headed towards the cabin that Tabby and I shared and stopped right in front of the open hatch. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. She had just woken up. The alarm clock had rung. God, she's so beautiful, I thought, stepping toward her. "Are you ready for dinner?" she asked defiantly. I smiled and sat down on her bed. "You know you're ready," I said and started kissing her. Then we made love. "God, that felt so good," she said. "I really needed that." "Me too," I told her. "I missed you." "And I missed you too. I love you so much." "I love you too," I replied. "You better get cleaned up and get on the road," she said. "You haven't even eaten yet." I looked at the time and saw that it was about 40 minutes until the end of break. "Yeah, you're right," I said. "Do you want to do it again, maybe on your lunch break?" "Sure, why not?" she said with a smile. Feeling a little better, I got out of bed, took a quick shower, and headed for the galley. Before leaving the cabin, I kissed her, then dimmed the lights and lowered the gravity level in the room to 0.7 G. I knew the only reason I could perform was my knowledge of GravTach, and I knew Bull wasn't familiar with it. Keep in mind that doing this in space is a tricky business. Forget what you've seen in the movies. For starters, microgravity makes the blood rush to your head. Fortunately, the gravity on the ship was defaulted to 0.8 G, which barely allowed us to enjoy each other. But it still wasn't easy. I had no doubt that if the gravity had been set lower than it was now, we probably wouldn't have been able to do what we did. Another problem is that microgravity lowers testosterone levels, and over a long period of time, the heart can shrink, reducing the volume of blood in the circulatory system. These are just some of the reasons why NASA was against sending couples into space even a century ago. Another reason was due to complications during pregnancy and childbirth. Nevertheless, over the years, there have been many stories involving couples in orbit. I remember reading about a cosmonaut who spent 14 months on the Russian Mir station in the 1990s. According to the story, he became close to a female cosmonaut, leading some to believe they were doing dirty deeds in orbit. Kremlin officials denied the allegations, and the cosmonaut himself later wrote, "We don't need to talk about what we crave. Men think about these things. It is impossible to brush them off. But with time, these thoughts somehow subside," he wrote. He also said that his superiors suggested he bring a doll with him, but he was afraid he might get too attached to the inflatable toy. Many of the restrictions of the old space administration were carried over when the Corps began sending people into orbit. But the development of artificial gravity in the early 2090s made many of those restrictions moot. So the Corps backed off a bit and allowed married couples to have sexual relations in space as long as they used birth control and had a gravity level of 0.8 G. I felt much better as I ate my tuna sandwich and headed back to the bridge. When I got there, it was still 2 minutes until break. Alan looked at me as I took my seat. "Did you have a good lunch, Lieutenant?" He asked. "Yes, sir, a very good lunch," I answered him. He smiled and nodded his head. "Good, carry on," he said, and went back to his console. The next 17 days went pretty much the same. Tabby came to our quarters a few times during our lunch break, and of course, I joined her on my lunch breaks whenever possible. Being able to see each other at least part of the time helped me get through this part of the trip. I didn't see Bull as much during this time, and that helped too. Of course, I still had some concerns, but I hadn't seen or heard anything to suggest that anything suspicious was going on. Alice kept me informed, but said she hadn't seen or heard anything either. When we got to Mars Station, I began to think I may have made a big deal out of it. After the Armstrong docked at Mars Station, I put on my Class C uniform, anticipating shore leave with Tabby. But my hopes of spending time with her at Huygens Base, a domed structure named after the Dutch astronomer who drew pictures of the red planet with a telescope of his own design, were dashed when Bull informed me that there was a problem with one or more of the weapon stations. What? I asked, shocked. I'd last checked them only a few hours ago during my shift, and there hadn't been any problems with them. I looked at Lieutenant Robinson. Were you aware of any problems? I asked him. He shook his head. Just before the dock, sir, he told me. There was something very suspicious about that, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. We were only here for 72 hours, Bull said, and by the time we launch, these weapons should be ready to go. So you'd better get on it, Jones. I looked at Tubby and shook my head. It'll be okay, honey, she said with a sad expression on her face. We'll still have a chance to visit Huygens together. I'll bring you a souvenir, okay? Bull grinned. Don't worry, Jones. I'll keep an eye on your wife. I promise, he said. Yeah, I have no doubt you will, you son of a bitch, I thought. At that moment, Alan walked over to us. So are you guys ready to relax on the beach for a while? He asked. Yeah, Bull replied. But Jones needs to take a look at the weapon systems. Is there a problem? Alan asked. The calibration of the two mini lasers is off, sir, said Robinson. When did this happen? Alan asked. I noticed it before I cordoned off the station, sir, said Robinson. Alan frowned and looked at me. Then you'd better take a look, Lieutenant, he said. I'll look at them with you if you don't mind. Not at all, sir, I said, glancing at Bull. I appreciate it. I'll stay and help, Lieutenant, Robinson said. Thanks, Robinson, I appreciate that, I said. Well, I guess we better get to the station before all the shuttles leave, Bull said. Tabby looked at me sadly, but didn't say anything. Do it, number one, Alan said. Bull and Tabby turned and walked away. I couldn't help but notice that she never told me she loved me or that I would see her later. I turned and looked at Alice. This stinks to high heaven, Bill, she told me quietly. I'll keep an eye on them over there. Thanks, I said. She smiled and patted me on the arm before walking away. Well, I guess I'd better change into my work clothes, I said. Which lasers are you having trouble with? Number 2 and number 5, sir, Robinson said. No. Okay, I'll take number 2 if you can check number 5, but we need to check them all, I said. On my way, sir, Robinson said. I turned to leave and saw Alan looking at the door that Bull and Tubby had come out through earlier. I could see the wheels turning in his head. I'll change and meet you at the second laser station if that's okay with you, sir, I said. I'll meet you there in a few minutes, he said. I grabbed my tool bag and left the bridge. I had been at the station for a few minutes when Alan appeared next to me. I noticed that he had changed back into his work uniform. What's that word? He asked. Just getting ready to remove the control box cover, I replied. I pulled out a tool and began to remove the cover. With the cover off, I looked inside and saw the problem. One of the gears that make up the drive system had come loose and broken. The E-clamp that held it in place was also missing. I looked to see if it was lying around at the bottom of the sealed unit, but it wasn't there. It was missing completely. Shit, I said. What? Alan asked. Someone's been in that unit, sir, I said. The E-clamp is gone and the drive gear is sheared off and broken. What would have happened if a weapon had been brought into play? The force of the drive's impact would have completely destroyed the system. If lasers were firing at the same time, they could have cut through the hull, I said. Damn it. How do you think that could have happened? He asked. I shook my head. Someone must have done it on purpose, I said. I don't understand how a clip can just go missing like that. The thing is, devices like this are usually sealed. You can only get inside with a special tool. This one here, I added, holding the tool in my hand. Can it be repaired? He asked. Of course, I said. There are spare control units in the armory, but it's not a part that usually breaks, and we only have 2 spare control units. Hopefully, none of the others are damaged. How long will the repair take? We'll have to disassemble the entire unit, install a new control unit, test, adjust, and calibrate. About 8 to 10 hours in total, And that's assuming there are no other problems. Damn, he said. All right, install the new control unit. Do you need my help? Although it was time-consuming, it was a one-man job and I really didn't need his help. Still, what he offered meant a lot, and I grew to respect him even more for it. I shook my head. No, sir, I can manage, but thanks for asking anyway, I said. Besides, there's only room for one pair of hands. At that moment, my wrist communicator beeped. I looked at it and saw it was a call from Robinson. Jones, come on, Robinson, I said, turning to the communicator. Boss, it looks like the E-clamp has broken off and the drive gear is completely sheared off, he said. I looked at Alan. We need to replace the entire control box. Okay, I said, get to it. Contact the armory, have them check all weapon platforms. On it, he said. And what's the likelihood of 2 control units failing at the same time? Alan asked. Very small, I said. I've never seen one of these units break down like that, let alone 2 at the same time. These are probably the most stable platforms in our arsenal. Could it be a manufacturing problem? He asked. Very unlikely, sir, I said. These devices go through extensive testing before installation. I've worked with hundreds of these devices and I've never seen this happen. Good, I'll report it to Houston, Alan said. We'd better get the engineers from the Martian station down here and run a full level 5 diagnostic. It's hard to believe a $1 trillion spacecraft can be stopped by a 50-cent E-clip. I grinned. Report back to me as soon as you're done. Yes, sir, I said. I watched him make his way out of the cramped quarters and went back to my work. When the control box was completely removed, I examined it carefully to see what else I could find. There, on the inside of the hull, was a dark spot. It didn't look like transmission grease. Looking closer, I realized it was blood. Whoever had sabotaged this device had cut their hand on the hull. I got some tweezers out of my toolbox and was able to take some of the substance. I put it in a small plastic bag, sealed it, and put it back in the tool bag. I intended to take it to a medical facility for DNA testing. By then, one of the gunsmiths had brought in a new control box and took the old one away. I went back to my work and tried to focus on what I was doing, but it was difficult. I was thinking about who could have done this and why. And then it hit me. Bull had done everything he could to keep Tabby and me apart on this trip. First, the shift schedule had changed. Of course, he offered an explanation. Alan accepted it, but I didn't believe him. Then this happened. What did he say when he and Tubby left for Hughes? Something about taking care of Tubby? Maybe. The thought that Tabby might be cheating on me with him made me furious and nauseous at the same time. I knew Bull had been her counselor at the academy, and I also knew they'd served together a couple times since then. Had she really been having fun with him even then? I finally finished installing the new control box and did a dry test. Everything seemed to be in order, and I made an entry in the maintenance log. 10 hours of my life were gone. 10 hours that I would never get back. 10 hours I was to spend on Huygens with Tabby. Finished, I looked through the entire journal, but saw nothing that would give me a clue. I saw Robinson as I climbed out of the access tube. How did it go? I asked him. The new unit is in place, sir, he replied. The gunners have checked the rest of the stations and haven't reported any other problems. In any case, I need a full visual inspection of everything, as well as an inventory of all weapons and missiles, I said. I know it will ruin your shore leave, but it needs to be done. I understand, sir, he said. I'll get on it. Thank you, I said. He nodded his head, smiled, and turned to his work. On my way to the bridge, I stopped in sickbay and spoke to the orderly on duty. How are you doing, Lieutenant Jones? The older woman asked as I walked in. Would you agree to do a DNA test? I asked. We have the equipment, but the final analysis must be confirmed by a certified lab, she replied. Why do you ask? I pulled out my sample and held it out to her. I need to know whose blood this is, I said. Can you do that? Sure, she said. It'll take a few hours and we'll need to compare it to the DNA we have. Why would you want to do that? I really can't talk about that right now, Chief, I said. I just need to know who she is. And I need you to keep it a secret. She looked at me in surprise. Okay, Lieutenant, she said. I'll look into it and send you a message when I have something. Thanks, Chief. I owe you one, I said. Damn right, sir, she said with a smile. She was quite attractive, and for a moment I wondered what she looked like without that uniform. But only for a moment. After that, I headed to the bridge to make my report. When I got up to the bridge, Alan was standing at the hatch leading to his ready room. "Fixed it?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I replied. "Lieutenant Robinson is checking the rest of the systems now." "Good. Step into my office if you would be so kind," he said. I walked into the ready room and saw Alice with Lieutenant Commander Carson, the ship's senior security officer. When Alan entered the small room, he closed the hatch and sat down in his seat. "Thank you for showing up so quickly," he said, looking at Alice and Commander Carson. "I'm sorry to interrupt your shore leave, Alice, but it seems we have a situation here and I need you and Commander Carson to resolve it immediately." "No problem, sir," she replied. "Looks like we have a saboteur on board," Alan said. "Two of our weapons systems appear to have been sabotaged shortly before arriving at Mars Station, and I've been tasked by Command to conduct an initial investigation. I've also been instructed to contact the Core Criminal Investigations Division on Huygens. They won't be able to get anyone here for at least 36 hours, so you have that time to find out everything you can. I'm temporarily giving you both access to the entire history of the tracker. I want to know who accessed these armed devices, and I want to find out as soon as possible. I want this investigation to be thorough but discreet. Do you understand me? I don't want the crew members to find out," he said. "We understand, sir," Commander Carson said. "In the meantime, the engineering team from Mars is running full diagnostics on the ship on Level 5. It's going to take about 72 hours. Command doesn't want us heading out with a possible saboteur on board, and I agree with them. It's quite possible the mission will be cancelled," Alan said. "Any questions or comments?" "Just one, sir," I said. All eyes turned to me. "Yes, Lieutenant?" Alan asked. "I found blood on the control box housing I replaced. I took a sample to sickbay for DNA analysis," I said. "Good idea," said Alan. "I'll swing by sickbay. Who did you give the sample to?" "To Chief Benson, sir," I said. He nodded his head in acknowledgement. "Good. I'll talk to her when I get there. Thank you. Anything else?" We all shook our heads. "Dismissed. You have a job to do." "Yes, sir," Commander Carson said. We left the ready room and I locked my tool bag on the weapons console. I was about to leave the bridge when Alice called out to me. "Yes, ma'am," I said, giving her my attention. "Bill, I've been watching Tubby and Commander Travers for a while. I'm sorry, but I think they know each other too well, if you know what I mean," she said. She pulled out her cell phone and showed me the pictures. I was shocked by what I saw. Tubby and Bull were walking into the club hand in hand. Alice had pictures of them dancing and drinking, acting like two teenagers on a date. There was the usual flirting and touching, and Alice had pictures of them kissing. Then she showed me pictures of them walking into the hotel. It didn't take a scientist to figure out what they were doing there. "I'm sorry, Bill," she said quietly. "I thought you should know." "Thanks, Alice," I said, holding back tears. "Are you going to report this to the captain?" "You know I have no choice but to report it," she said. "But I thought you should be the first to know." "I appreciate that," I said. I left the bridge and caught up with Robinson. We finished sorting out the rest of the systems and took inventory. My shift was over and I went to the galley to get something to eat, then went back to my quarters and tried to sleep. It wasn't easy with images of Tubby and Bull running through my head, but I managed to get through a few hours. I woke up, showered, dressed, and was about to leave when Tabby came into the cabin. She looked rested and her face was shining. "Did you have a good time?" I asked in a neutral tone. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I did," she replied. "We just got back. I'm sorry you weren't able to join us. Maybe next time." I just looked at her. "What's going on? I saw all the engineers at the station." "Maintenance," I said. "So what's on your agenda?" "Well, I'm going to lie down for a while. I'm really tired and I'm off duty for the next 12 hours. Are you going on duty now?" "Yes," I said. "Have you managed to solve this little problem?" "I think so." "Good," she said. "You know I missed you out there." "Really? That's not what I heard," I said. "What does that mean?" "I heard you and Bull had a good time without me," I said. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" "We danced a little," she said. "Had a couple drinks each. But that was the end of it." "Nothing else happened?" I asked. "Of course not," she said, feigning shock. "What makes you think that?" "Nothing," I said. "I have to go to work." I headed for the door, but Tabby stopped me. She tried to kiss me, but I turned away and she kissed my cheek. Bill, you know I love you, she said. What's going on? You tell me, I said. I walked out of the cabin without giving her a chance to answer. Who is this woman? I asked myself. Did she really think she could come to me right after she slept with another guy and expect me to act like it was no big deal? Did she really think I wouldn't be able to recognize her lies? I walked into my station and realized I hadn't seen Bull. I went about my normal business and moved on to my current diagnostics. About 7 hours into my shift, I realized I hadn't eaten anything and headed out for my lunch break. I decided to go to my quarters and see Tabby for a bit before returning to duty. I had planned to talk things over with her, but when I opened the hatch, what stood before me was something no husband should ever have to see. On the double bed that Tabby and I shared, Tabby was lying on top of Bull. I felt an increase in gravity and looked to see that the gravity in the cabin was set at 0.9 G. They both turned around to see who was standing in the open hatch. Tabby jumped down and he turned to me with a smirk on his face. "Close the damn hatch," he growled. "What are you, some kind of pervert or something? Do you like to watch?" "What's going on here?" I asked. Tabby found something interesting on the deck to gawk at while Bull rose to his feet. "What does it look like, Lieutenant?" he asked, pulling on his clothes. "Didn't they teach you sex education in school?" He finished putting on his flight suit and headed toward me. "Let's take a walk, Lieutenant. We need to talk." He turned to Tabby. "I'll be back and we can finish this conversation later." Tabby looked at me with sad eyes. "I'm sorry, Bill," she said quietly. "We'll talk about it later," I said. Bull shook his head. "No, Lieutenant," he said. "Come on, follow me." As we turned, I activated the video recording function on my suit. All of our suits had a TV camera function that could be activated when needed. I had a very bad feeling about this, and I wanted our encounter to be recorded. "I must commend you, Lieutenant. It was a great idea to reduce the gravity in your quarters," Bull said as we walked down the corridor. "But you should know that I've been here a little longer than you have. It didn't take me long to realize what you did." "How long?" I asked. "You mean how long, sir, don't you, Lieutenant?" he asked with a smirk. I remained silent, encouraging him to continue. "Well, I suppose you have a right to know. It started in my second year at the academy. I was her counselor, you know. She came to me with a problem. I was able to solve it. But it cost her money. And it just kept escalating. You know, she almost broke up with you a couple times during your time at the academy. You see, once a woman gets a taste of Bull, she can't forget it anymore." "No." He must have thought he was being funny because he laughed at his own joke. I felt nothing but rage. I wanted to kill him on the spot, but I had no desire to ruin my career over this piece of shit. "So you entertain her every chance you get, huh?" I asked. "Of course I do, Lieutenant," he replied. "You know, you must be one hell of an investigator." "Say that." "And that's the real reason you changed the bridge schedule, isn't it?" I asked. "Right again, Jones," he said. "And the reason you sabotaged those weapons systems," I added. "Just between you and me, yes," he said. "But you see, after the skipper informed me of the sabotage, I did a little investigation of my own," he added, taking the word investigation in quotation marks. "And what are you going to do next?" I asked. "Are you planning to beat me up or kill me?" He laughed as we turned the corner and entered the elevator. He pressed the third deck button and waited for the elevator doors to close. "Of course not, Lieutenant," he said. "You think I'd kill a highly trained officer just for a piece of ass?" "For the moment, yes," I said. The elevator doors opened and he stepped out, gesturing for me to follow him. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "According to my investigation, which I've just completed. Confused, you took to sabotaging weapons systems, hoping to frame your wife's lover. When she told you that she intended to divorce you for him, you became desperate and killed yourself." He stopped, and I saw that we were standing in front of the starboard airlock, an airlock that was on the opposite side of the station from where we had docked. The inner hatch was open, and I saw that all the spacesuits in the airlock had been removed. I also saw in his hand a semi-automatic pistol strapped to his right wrist. I wondered when he had time to put it on, and realized that he must have hidden it in his spacesuit. "You've got it all covered, haven't you?" I asked. "Yes," he replied with a smirk on his face. "Don't worry, Lieutenant. After you leave, I'll take care of her properly. In the meantime, go to the airlock." "You won't get away with it," I said. At this, he laughed. "Yeah? Who do you think Command will believe? A pisket who can't even satisfy his own wife, or a 20-year veteran of spaceflight. Now get to the airlock, he said. I looked around and assessed the situation. Glancing at the nearest gravity regulator, I saw that it was set at 0.8 G. Not ideal, but I figured it was for the best. It was now or never. I jumped up as high as I could and rested one hand on the bulkhead. I kicked as hard as I could twice, catching him off guard and hitting him in the face both times. The force of the blow threw him back into the airlock where he landed on the floor. His face showed blood where I had hit him. As soon as he landed, I rushed to the control panel and quickly closed and locked the hatch. No! He shook his head, surprised at what had just happened. He looked at me, furious. Open the damn door, Lieutenant, he shouted. Just one question, Commander, I said. What's that? Did Tabitha know what you were about to do? Of course she knew, he said. It was her idea. Now open the damn door. I'm not telling you anything else, he added, raising his gun. He cocked the trigger and aimed right at me. Now, damn it. I looked at the controls before answering. Yes, sir, I hissed, pressing a brightly lit button. His eyes widened as he realized what I had done. The outer door hissed open, and the air from the room rushed outside. Caught off guard, he stumbled and quickly found himself in the harshest environment known to man. I watched his body tumble through space as he left the ship. I knew he would only last 15 seconds without a spacesuit. There is no pressure in space, and I knew that the air left in his lungs would quickly expand and painfully tear his lung tissue. He would either freeze to death or die of suffocation. I pressed the button to activate the comms. Man overboard, number 2 starboard airlock, I said. Instantly, the alarm sounded and a crowd appeared at the airlock. I looked up and saw Alan running toward me. Next to him was Alice. A few moments later, I saw Tubby. Commander Travers, sir, I said. I handed him a tiny disc with a videotape of the last few minutes. He admitted to sabotaging the weapons and admitted that he was having an affair with Lieutenant Jones. He also admitted that he planned to kill me and frame it as a suicide. It's all here. Bull, Tabby exclaimed, peering into the airlock. By now, the force of Bull's ejection had sent his body into an unstable orbit around Mars, and it would take hours to recover, if at all. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. You killed him? She screamed. You damned bastard. You killed him. I hate you. Do you hear me? I hate you. That will be enough, Lieutenant, Alan ordered. He grabbed Tabby by the shoulders and handed her to the orderlies. Take her to sick bay. Get her under control. Then hand her over to security. He turned to me as the orderlies carried her away. You know what to do, Lieutenant, he said sadly. I have no choice. You are relieved of all duties for the duration of the investigation. I'll take it over. Yes, sir, I said quietly. Okay, that's enough, Alan ordered. Get back to work. There's nothing more we can do here. Before he spoke again, he turned to Commander Carson. When she calms down, give her a statement. I don't want her anywhere near the bridge. Call Mars Station and find out how to recover Commander Travers's body. Yes, sir, Carson said before walking away. Alan turned to Alice. Looks like you just got promoted, Alice, he said. Until further notice, you're my number 1. You'll need to adjust your assignments on the bridge. After that, the mission will probably be canceled. I understand, sir, she said. Commander Carson and I have completed our initial investigation, sir. We would like to discuss our findings with you. In my room, number 1, he said, immediately. Yes, sir, she said. Before she left, she turned to me. I'm sorry, Bill, she said to me. You didn't deserve any of this. Thank you, Commander, I said and headed for my quarters. Once there, I pulled out all of Tabby's things and put them in her duffel bag. I didn't want her anywhere near me, and I knew she would probably be assigned the cabin originally designated for the chief pilot, which was now empty. A couple hours later, someone from security came and took her things. I didn't know where they'd taken them, and frankly, I didn't care. I flipped the rubberized mattress over and replaced the soiled linens, tossing the old ones into the laundry basket. I knew I would be confined to my quarters until further notice, and my access would be limited to the galley and gym. So I sat down at the computer console in my stateroom and began looking through the JAG forms until I found one requesting a divorce. I filled out the form requesting a divorce on the grounds of adultery. Since our marriage was under the jurisdiction of the JAG Corps, the divorce petition had to be filed by them. There was nothing to divide. There were no children. We each had the same paycheck, so there was no alimony. It was simple. She would keep what was hers, and I would keep what was mine. I asked that she give up my last name and return her rings. After verifying everything, I clicked submit and waited for confirmation that the request had been received by the JAG system. It's amazing how fast the system works sometimes. Not 24 hours after the incident, and I was already talking to not one, but two CIA agents on Huygens. It was clear to me that they were trying to prove that I had acted out of revenge. The JAG officer they took with them to represent me at the interrogation did not allow me to make any statements that might incriminate me. I spent the next 24 hours in suspense, waiting to see if they would take me into custody. I spent most of the time pacing back and forth in my quarters. I knew that what Tubby and Bull had done would now become common knowledge on the ship, so I purposely stayed away from the galley during the regular meals, so I wouldn't run into the rest of the crew. I was sitting on the bed when I heard a knock on the hatch. I wondered if it was station security coming to take me into custody and prepared for the worst. "It's open," I said. When the hatch opened, I saw Alan and Alice standing there. I turned my attention to them as they entered the small room. "As you were, Lieutenant," Alan said as he sat down in a chair. Alice sat down as well. I relaxed and sat back down on the bed. "They found Commander Travers' body on Mars Station. They also took the illegal firearm that was strapped to his arm. We've reviewed all the evidence, and the CIU report says you acted in self-defense. The tracking logs show that Commander Travers was at both weapon stations where the sabotage occurred just before Lieutenant Robinson noticed the calibration error," Alice added. "And the DNA from the blood found matches the commander's. Put that together with what he confessed to you, and it becomes clear that he was the one who sabotaged both of those systems," Alan said. "Your wife claims she knew nothing about the sabotage, but she supposedly knew what he intended to do to you." "But Travers told me it was her idea," I said. "Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Who knows? At any rate, she's being held in the brig as an accessory to a conspiracy to murder Commander Travers. She'll probably be charged with conspiracy, but that's up to the authorities on Earth." "So we're going back to Earth, sir?" I asked. He nodded his head. "That's right, Bill," he said. "The mission has been canceled, at least for the moment. Command intends to hold a board of inquiry when we get back." "Does that mean I can go back to work?" I asked. "It's taken some work, but I've convinced Houston that you're needed on the bridge since we're short 2 officers. Do you think you can handle both operations and artillery control? Alice tells me you're ready for operational control." "Yes, sir," I said. "Good," he said. "We launch in 12 hours, so I want you rested and ready to go." "Thank you, sir," I said. "Is it okay if I see my wife? I have a few questions I need to answer." "Are you sure you want to do that, Bill?" he asked. "I'm absolutely sure, sir," I told him. He thought for a moment, then nodded his head. "All right, Bill," he said at last. "I'll authorize it, but on the condition that you be accompanied by Commander Brewster. Do you agree, Alice?" "Yes, sir," she said. "Correct," he said. "Well, get to work, son, and then get some rest. It's about time you started earning your paycheck." "Yes, sir," I said. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. When he left, Alice looked at me. "Are you ready, Lieutenant?" she asked. I nodded my head. "Yes, ma'am," I said. We got out of the car and headed for the brig, located on the lower deck of the ship. "Don't tell anyone I told you this, but Captain Simmons gave you a commendation," she said. "For what?" I asked, surprised. "He said that your actions saved not only your life, but the lives of many of your comrades. Had Travers fired that weapon while in the airlock, there is no telling what damage would have been done to the ship," she said. "Damn it," I said. She smiled. "Congratulations," she said. Finally, we got to the brig and checked in with the security officer on duty. Then we walked to a tiny 7-by-6-foot cell where Tabby, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, was sitting on a bed. "What do you want, Lieutenant?" she asked with sarcasm and mockery in her voice. "It's Lieutenant now, not even Bill or Lieutenant Jones," I said. "All right, have it your way, prisoner. I only have a few questions and then I'll leave you alone." "Ask your questions, Lieutenant," she said, looking straight ahead, not even bothering to look at me. "How long have you been having fun with Travers?" "Since my sophomore year at the academy," she replied. "He was my counselor." "I know," I said. "And how did it all start?" "Do you really want to know?" she asked. "Yes, I know," I said. "Okay, since you asked, I failed the test. He corrected it for me. I almost lost the assignment, but I didn't. Thanks to him, I was able to retake the test. I was indebted to him, so I entertained him. I liked having fun with him, so I kept doing it. Snap. So you cheated on each other and then repaid him by cheating on me. Is that right? Yes, she said. You have no idea how many times you had me within hours of him doing it. And you know what? I loved it. And you know what else? What? I asked, ready to vomit after what she'd just told me. He's been to places you could never get to. I'm surprised you were even able to touch me after the fun he had with me. Yeah, and did you have fun with him all those times you worked with him? When we could, she replied. You know it's almost impossible to keep busy in the low class. That's why we did it before we left and after we came back. Did you ever love me? Or is it all a lie? I loved you, she said. But I liked to have fun with him. And that's all it was, nothing more. You knew what he was going to do when we came aboard, didn't you? Yes, I knew. I knew he was going to spread out the shifts so we couldn't see each other much. But he didn't think you'd find a way to carve out time to talk to me. To be honest, neither did I. But you tricked us both. So we decided to wait until we got to Mars, she said. And you knew he was going to sabotage the weapons platforms? I knew he was going to do something, but I didn't know what, she said. All I knew was that he was going to make it so you couldn't take shore leave. We didn't think you'd turn this into a federal case. And the fact that I threw myself out of the airlock was just icing on the cake, right? He told me it was your idea. Was it? Did you really hate me so much you wanted to kill me? It was his idea, she said. But you put up with it. You never once did anything or told anyone to make it stop, did you? No, I didn't, she said quietly. And I'm sorry about that. I didn't think he'd actually do it. Well, he tried, and he didn't succeed. And you're going to end up in jail for your part in it. I hope it was worth it. By the way, I filed for divorce. Big deal, she said with a shrug. I shook my head and stood up. I was so proud of you the way you handled the ship. I loved you with all my heart. But now, I wish I had never met you. I can't wait to testify against you at your court-martial. Goodbye, bitch. I turned to leave and heard her call my name. I'm sorry, Bill, she cried. Really, I'm sorry. Without looking back, I raised my middle finger and walked on. After returning to Earth, Tabby was placed in a federal prison, where she remained throughout her interrogation and court-martial. Several crew members, including myself, Alan, and Alice, were called to testify. We spent hours giving evidence and answering questions from several interrogators and senior officers. Worst of all were the days spent waiting for something, anything, to happen. The only thing that did happen was the approval of my divorce, which was received in early April. All that was left was to file the paperwork in state court, which the JAG officer said he would do. Finally, on Friday, April 18th, we were called into the hearing room to learn our fate. Alan, Alice, and I sat in one row, and Tabby was brought out into the audience. Like us, she was in uniform, but unlike us, she wore chains around her ankles and wrists. 2 armed prison guards in black uniforms accompanied her, ready for action. We all stood as the council members were ushered into the hall, their uniforms adorned with ribbons and gold braids denoting their rank. Admiral Cartwright, the senior member of the council, opened the meeting. Please be seated, he began. Let me begin by saying that this is simply a council of inquiry, not a court of law. Our job is to find out what happened and make recommendations so it doesn't happen again. He then read the board's summary of what happened during the Mars mission. He concluded simply by saying, in summary, Commander Travers's personal plans trumped his duty to his ship, captain, crew, and the Corps, resulting in a violation of the law, not to mention a number of established protocols. As a result of his actions, many of those who served aboard the Armstrong were put in danger and the ship was put out of commission, he said. He turned his attention to me. Senior Lieutenant William Jones, he said. Hearing my name, I froze in place. He stared at me for a moment before continuing. Lieutenant Jones, the board has reviewed all of the evidence in this case and has concluded that your actions not only saved your own life, but quite possibly the lives of many of your shipmates as well. In addition, your diligence, initiative, and attention to detail were instrumental in detecting and eliminating deliberate sabotage that could very easily have cost the lives of many people, not to mention a trillion-dollar spaceship. The board has reviewed your record and concurred with Captain Simmons's assessment. As a result, we have approved his recommendation to award you the Distinguished Service Medal. In addition, we believe your talents will be of great benefit to the court in our future endeavors. You can expect your order to arrive at the Spacecraft Advanced Operations School for classes that will begin June 1st. Congratulations, and best of luck. Thank you, sir, I said. The Admiral nodded his head and turned his attention to Alan. Captain Alan Simmons, he said. Alan stood at attention. Please understand that the Council believes that you did the best you could under the circumstances. We understand your desire not to undermine the authority of senior personnel in the eyes of the crew, and frankly, none of us have ever faced a situation like this before. However, as captain and master of your ship, you are directly responsible for everything that happens on it. I understand, Admiral, Alan said. Nip. The Council agrees that you should remain in command of the USS Armstrong, but there is a notation to that effect in your personnel file. The Armstrong is currently undergoing modernization, and a new crew will be assigned to it. We agree that Lieutenant Commander Brewster would be a good choice as first officer. Therefore, the Council recommends that she be immediately promoted to commander and appointed first officer. You can expect a new set of mission orders shortly, he said. Thank you, Admiral, Alan said. The Admiral then shifted his gaze to Tabby. Senior Lieutenant Tabitha Abernathy, he said, calling Tabby by her maiden name, which she had to take after her divorce. Tabby stood up as the others did. It would be an understatement to say that this board is very disappointed in you. Not only have you dishonored your ex-husband, you have dishonored your uniform and the service as a whole. Your actions in this whole sordid affair, no pun intended, may well have jeopardized the lives of many of your comrades, including your ex-husband. As a result of the statements entered into the record by both you and Commander Travers, we were forced to evaluate your entire record, including your work at the Academy. We have been able to confirm that Commander Travers, acting as your counselor, intervened to help you pass a test that you initially failed. Had he not intervened on your behalf, you likely would not have passed the test and would not have received your commission. Of course, your record as a pilot has been exemplary, but we can't help but believe that you should not have gotten your commission to begin with. The sexual encounter you had with Commander Travers cost him his life and nearly cost the lives of your ex-husband and several other people. Your actions can only be described as unworthy of your position. We realize you are currently facing court-martial for your actions, but this board has recommended to the Office of Personnel Management that you be stripped of your commission and demoted in rank and pay to an E1 crewman. They have agreed, and your new rank and pay are effective immediately. Take her away, he ordered, turning to the guards. They turned her toward the door and started to lead her out, but she stopped and walked over to Alan, Alice, and me. Bill, she began, tears rolling down her face. Be careful when you address me, crewman, I said stiffly. She jumped up and looked straight in front of her, tears streaming down her cheeks. Permission to address you, Lieutenant, she said. Denied, I growled. Put that thing out of my sight, I ordered the guards. They froze in anticipation. Yes, sir. They took her under the arms and led her out while she sobbed. At this point, I didn't care what she said. A copy of the Council's opinion will be sent to each of you and placed in your permanent file. The Council meeting is adjourned, Admiral Cartwright announced as he tapped his gavel. We stood as the Council left the room. When they left, Alan turned to me. Well, that wasn't so bad, he said. Why don't we have a beer or something? I'm parched. Sounds good to me, sir, Alice said. What the hell, I added. We left the building and headed to the O Club, where we continued to enjoy a nice buzz. Epilogue. 17 months later, standing at the airlock leading to the Galileo station orbiting the dark side of Mars, I thought back over the past 17 months. Tabby's court-martial had concluded a month before I entered the School of Advanced Spacecraft Management. I had, of course, testified for the prosecution, and had done so enthusiastically, though I hated to think of the time I had spent with her and Bull on Armstrong. When they brought her in, Tabby looked pretty damn attractive. This time she was wearing a crewman's uniform and no flying wings. She had lost weight, and her eyes were sad and sunken. She had lost everything she loved, the rank, the wings, the man she had once called husband and lover. She had also lost all hope of a career as a pilot. No matter what happened to her today, her record was forever tarnished, and she would never take the helm of another spaceship, civilian or military. The members of the court-martial entered the courtroom, and we all stood until we were told we could take our seats. The judge looked at the members of the jury and asked if a verdict had been reached. "We have reached a verdict, Your Honor," said the most senior of the members, a full commander. Answering the question, the commandant said the jury had found Tabby guilty of accessory to the attempted murder of me, but not guilty of the conspiracy charge. Apparently, the defense won the argument that it was all he said, she said, and there was no direct evidence that she actively participated in the conspiracy to kill me. However, there was ample evidence that she knew of Travers's plan to throw me out of the airlock, but did nothing to prevent it. The judge had no mercy on her and sentenced her to 10 years hard labor in a federal prison. At the end of that 10-year term, she was also to receive a dishonorable discharge. The judge thanked the jury and banged his gavel, concluding the case. Tabby was let out the same way she was brought in chains. She never once looked at me or tried to talk to me. I went to the class, which was held in Florida near Cape Canaveral, and enjoyed the training. I also enjoyed the weather and the scenery, which included a lot of naked female flesh. After a year and a half, we graduated, and I was promoted to lieutenant commander. I also received a number of orders that led me to Galileo. This station, unlike the Martian station, was a closed facility that orbited the red planet in such a way that it could not be seen from Earth. I had no idea what was going on here, and I was curious, to say the least. When the door opened, I was greeted by an attractive female captain who was taking my orders. I introduced myself and shook her hand. "Nice to meet you, Commander Jones," she said. "I'm Captain Hawkins. I'm familiar with your service on the Armstrong and have heard good things about you from Captain Simmons. I've also spoken to Alice Brewster." I looked at her and said nothing for a while. She told me what happened, and I'm sorry. I assure you there will be no problem with that here. So, are you ready to look at your house in the next few years? "Years?" I asked. She smiled and led me to the observation deck. When I joined her, she pressed a button and the glass in front of us dissipated. My eyes popped up to my forehead when I saw the monstrous ship in front of me. "This is the biggest, fastest, and most advanced ship in the fleet, Commander. And you will be my operations officer. So you are my number 2. Are you ready for adventure?" I saw her eyes sparkle when she said that. "Absolutely, Captain," I said. "Where are we headed?" "If all goes well, Commander, to Alpha Centauri." I looked at her, shocked. It was just over 4 light years away. "The plan is to break the light barrier. If everything works as stated, we'll get there in less than 2 years." "Is that even possible?" I asked. She smiled and nodded her head. "If the engineers are right, yes," she said. "Shit," I said. She laughed. "We launch in 15 days, Commander," she said. "You have a lot of homework to do, so you'd better get started on it. I like to give staff briefings at 0800 every day." "Yes, ma'am," I said. She held out her hand and I took it. "I have some things to do, but I'll be in touch." "Welcome aboard, Commander," she said before she left. After she left, I looked at the ship floating in the huge bay. I looked at the side of the ship and smiled as I noticed the name, USS Enterprise. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.